By the time I carried the glazed lemon cake into the dining room, the lead investor had already stopped chewing. Earlier, my husband had told me, "Make sure tonight is perfect." He thought I was merely serving dessert to the 13 people gathered around our candlelight table. He was wrong. Underneath the folded menu card at the investor's seat lay a cream-colored envelope. I watched his silver fork pause mid-air. Tonight was Women's Day, and I was serving the truth. My name is Camilla Green, and at 41 years old, I had mastered the brutal art of being invisible in my own home, the dining room of our upscale house in Franklin, Tennessee, was bathed in the warm, flickering glow of 24 beeswax candles. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of roasted citrus, deeply browned butter, and the sharp, clean edge of polished ambition. 13 people sat around the long, custom-milled walnut table. 12 of them were drinking expensive wine, laughing, and building a future. I was the 13th, moving calmly and silently between the dining room and the kitchen, orchestrating the final movements of a symphony that was about to crash spectacularly. At the head of the table sat my husband, Nolan. He was performing for the investors as if the evening, the house, and the very air we breathed belonged entirely to his brilliance. He leaned back in his upholstered chair, a glass of Cabernet loosely gripped in his right hand, flashing that practiced, humble yet hungry smile that had charmed his way into bank vaults and boardrooms across the South. "The secret," Nolan was saying, his voice resonating with calculated warmth, "is authenticity. You cannot fake the kind of heritage we are bringing to the national market. It requires a soul. It requires a story that people can taste in every single jar." He did not look at me when he said the word soul. He was looking directly at Reed Halpern, his lead investor. I moved silently behind Nolan, clearing the small plates that had held the whipped feta carrots and the cast-iron cornbread I had spent 3 hours perfecting. I stacked the fine bone china with fluid control. The guests saw exactly what Nolan wanted them to see: a devoted wife, the quiet domestic engine powering the brilliant entrepreneur. They did not see the cold, crystalline clarity behind my eyes, nor did they understand that the woman pouring their sparkling water was holding all of their futures in her hands. I returned to the kitchen to plate the final course. The lemon cakes sat on the cool marble counter, their thick sugar glaze catching the low light of the pendant lamps. Beside each porcelain dessert plate was a heavy, cream-colored envelope, sealed tight with unmarked wax. I arranged them on the serving trays. I carried the trays back into the dining room, my footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug. I set the plates down one by one, first in front of Dana Bishop, then Victor Lane, then Nolan's mother, Verna. Verna did not even pause her story about her recent trip to Charleston to acknowledge my presence. I was simply the help who happened to share her last name. Next was Sloane Mercer. Sloane was the polished brand consultant Nolan had been parading around for months. She wore a tailored silk blouse that cost more than my first car, and she leaned into Nolan's orbit with an ease that went far beyond professional courtesy. I placed her cake gently on the linen placemat. Then, I placed the envelope, tucking it just beneath her folded menu card. Finally, I served Reed Halpern. Reed was a man who noticed everything, which was exactly why I needed him to be the first one to look down. "Ah, a grand finale," Reed said, his eyes catching the edge of the thick paper protruding from under the menu. He set his wine glass down, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. He smiled, assuming it was a parting gift. A menu of tasting notes, perhaps, or a personalized thank you letter for attending this monumental dinner and bringing his capital to the table. He slid the cream-colored envelope out, broke the seal with his thumb, and unfolded the heavy stock paper inside. I stood near the arched doorway leading to the kitchen, folding my hands at my waist. I watched Reed's eyes scan the first line, then the second. He was not reading tasting notes about lemon zest and vanilla bean. He was reading a clean, professionally organized legal summary detailing exactly who owned the recipes, the product names, and the supplier agreements that Nolan had just spent the last 2 hours pitching as his own corporate assets. The transformation in Reed's posture was instantaneous and profound. The relaxed slump of a well-fed investor vanished. His spine stiffened, his brow furrowed and deep. Sudden confusion. He looked up, his eyes darting first to Nolan, who was still talking, then back to the paper, and finally, searching the room until they locked onto me standing in the shadows. I offered no smile. I gave no nod of confirmation. I simply watched him absorb the truth. Next to him, Dana Bishop noticed Reed's reaction and pulled her own envelope from beneath her card. Then Victor Lane did the same. The sharp rustle of heavy paper tearing open rippled down the length of the long walnut table, like a sudden gust of wind before a severe storm. Conversation did not end gracefully. It snapped mid-sentence. The warm, self-congratulatory chatter died completely in the throats of the guests. The rhythmic clinking of silver dessert forks against bone china slowed, hesitated, and then halted completely. The silence that fell over the room was heavy, total, and suffocating. It was the absolute sound of a carefully constructed reality crumbling into dust. Nolan was in the middle of a sentence about fourth-quarter projections. We anticipate a 30% margin increase by the end of the year, provided we scale our business correctly. He stopped. The words hung in the dead air. His charismatic smile held on his face for exactly 1 second too long. It was the terrifying, rigid freeze of a man who suddenly realizes the ground has vanished beneath his feet, but has not yet started to fall. He looked around his beautiful table, at his wealthy guests, fully expecting to see their usual admiration. Instead, he saw 12 people staring at legal documents with expressions ranging from severe concern to outright horror. Across the table, Sloane Mercer had opened hers. The blood drained entirely from her perfectly bronzed face, leaving her looking hollow and sick. Her manicured fingers trembled slightly as she read the top paragraph. She went completely still when she saw her own name printed inside the document. Realizing that whatever private promises and strategy sessions she had shared with Nolan were now exposed to the cold, unforgiving light of a formal audit. I remained standing by the doorway, perfectly still. I said absolutely nothing. I did not cross my arms in defiance. I did not smirk. I did not look triumphant or vindictive. My restraint, I could see in their wide eyes, was far more unnerving to them than if I had screamed and thrown the crystal wine goblets against the freshly painted walls. Anger is easy to dismiss as a woman being hysterical. Silence, paired with irrefutable, undeniable proof, is terrifying. The guests were beginning to understand. The rich food sitting heavily in their stomachs, the expensive wine warming their blood, the cozy, elegant evening they thought they were enjoying. None of it was real. The dinner they came to enjoy was not the dinner they were getting. They were sitting inside a perfectly set trap. And the quiet, dependable woman who had just poured their water had locked all the doors. Nolan's eyes finally dropped to the envelope resting by his own dessert plate. It was significantly thicker than the rest. He reached for it, his movements suddenly jerky and uncoordinated. Stripped of all his usual smooth grace, his face began to flush with a deep, mottled red. The handsome, confident facade melting away rapidly to reveal the frantic, furious boy hiding underneath. He ripped the heavy paper open. He stared at the divorce papers. He stared at the formal cease and desist demand regarding my intellectual property. He looked up at me, his chest heaving, his jaw tight, his mouth open to demand what I had done, to yell, to assert the dominance he thought he still possessed. He was about to shatter the terrible silence, to unleash the rage of a man whose stolen kingdom was burning down around him in real time. But to understand how we arrived at this explosive silence, to understand why a celebratory dinner party for 13 people on Women's Day became a stage for a brutal public collapse, you have to go back. You have to go back to the text message that woke me up exactly 12 hours earlier. People often mistake quiet competence for a lack of ambition. They look at a woman who keeps her head down, who remembers to order the custom shipping boxes exactly 3 weeks in advance, who knows precisely how much citric acid is required to make a jar of preserves safely shelf-stable, and they assume she is simply happy to be helpful. I was never just trying to be helpful. I was building a life. When Nolan and I first launched Hearth and Row Provisions 7 years ago, our grand corporate headquarters consisted of a single, scratched folding table at the Saturday farmers market. We stood side by side under a flimsy canvas pop-up tent in the sweltering July heat, selling small batch preserves and homemade grilling sauces. In those early days, Nolan frequently used the word we. We sold out of the blackberry jam. We need to buy a bigger commercial boiling pot. We are going to make this dream work. I loved the we. It felt like a shared trench, a mutual foxhole where my exhausting physical labor and his natural charisma combined into a force neither of us could generate alone. But as the business grew from that single folding table into a fast-growing specialty food company moving thousands of units across the state, the division of labor shifted drastically, and so did the pronouns. Hearth and Row expanded its line into stone-ground cornbread mixes, seasonal holiday gift boxes, and premium pantry staples. Almost overnight, Nolan became the definitive public face of the brand. He possessed the kind of effortless, golden boy charm that made regional retail buyers want to hand him massive purchase orders over expensive bourbon lunches. He wore tailored dark denim and crisp chambray shirts, perfectly playing the part of the modern, rugged Southern artisan entrepreneur. While Nolan was out shaking hands, playing golf with distributors, and posing for local lifestyle magazine spreads, I was the one anchored to the harsh concrete floor of our leased commercial kitchen. I handled the brutal, unglamorous anatomy of the business. I developed every single recipe from scratch. I ruthlessly negotiated the vendor contracts when wholesale glass jar prices spiked by 22%. I maintained the tedious, exacting food safety records required by state health inspectors. I calculated the ingredient costing down to the fraction of a penny, tracked complex shelf life notes, managed grueling production schedules, and caught subtle packaging corrections before thousands of misprinted labels could ruin our quarterly budget. Success usually hides its own dirty work behind a curtain of marketing, and I was the one standing behind that curtain, covered in flour and sweat. The true irony was that the very foundation of Nolan's booming artisan empire was pulled directly from my own family history. The company's absolute best-selling items did not come from a corporate marketing brainstorm. The smoked peach glaze, the sorghum barbecue base, and the whipped honey butter blend were direct adaptations of recipes I had painstakingly translated from my late grandmother's stained, spiral-bound notebooks. I spent hundreds of hours alone in my own kitchen, standing over simmering pots, tweaking ratios of apple cider vinegar and dark brown sugar, failing and starting over again until the flavor profiles were perfectly balanced and scalable for mass production. At first, I willingly accepted Nolan's public-facing role as a strategic necessity. I told myself it was simply good business for him to be the charming frontman while I ran the engine room. But somewhere along the line, the narrative warped permanently. The word we evaporated entirely from his vocabulary, replaced by a towering, self-important I. I had a vision for this barbecue base, he would confidently tell a local reporter, while I stood 10 feet away checking inventory intake sheets. I wanted to create something that honored authentic Southern roots. Everyone around him quickly adopted his revised version of reality, especially his family. His mother, Verna, had always viewed me with a mild, aristocratic suspicion, as if I had tricked her handsome son into a lesser life. As Hearth and Row grew profitable, Verna began treating me less like a co-founder and more like the domestic extension of Nolan's sheer brilliance. She would occasionally visit our production facility, walk right past the heavy pallets of raw ingredients I had spent 3 weeks sourcing, and pat my shoulder with a manicured hand. "You take such good care of his little operation, Camilla," Verna would say, adjusting her expensive silk scarf. "Behind every great visionary man, there is a sturdy woman keeping the floors clean." His sister, Elise, was profoundly worse. Elise possessed a sharp, opportunistic business degree and treated me like hourly labor who merely happened to wear a wedding ring. She would drop by the kitchen demanding premium sample boxes for her wealthy friends, never bothering to ask if I actually had the inventory to spare. She spoke to me in the clipped, impatient tones one reserves for a slow waiter. I was the help. I was the machinery. I was expected to produce without opinion. The erosion of my marriage and my self-worth did not happen in a single, explosive fight. It happened through 1,000 tiny, daily humiliations. I noticed the shift when my name was quietly left off the executive summary of the new investor pitch decks. I noticed it when Nolan would introduce me at industry networking events with a tight, condescending arm around my waist. "This is my wife, Camila," he would say to a prospective buyer, flashing his perfect white teeth. "She is the real magic in the kitchen." It was a highly calculated phrase. It sounded complimentary to a stranger, but it effectively stripped me of any actual corporate authority. It purposefully reduced my logistical expertise, my financial management, and my vital intellectual property into the quaint, domestic hobby of a supportive spouse baking cookies. And when the massive distribution checks finally started clearing the bank, my name was never on them. The revenue flowed into new holding accounts Nolan managed. Under a corporate structure, he was increasingly walling off from my view. Many women in my exact position might have cried. They might have confronted their husbands in the driveway, screaming about fairness, broken promises, and stolen credit. They might have demanded couples therapy or begged for an apology. I did not do any of those things. I am not a dramatic, weeping victim. I am a deeply practical, observant woman. I remember a specific Tuesday evening last November that cemented my silence. We had just received our first massive purchase order from a major regional grocery chain, calling for 5,000 units of the whipped honey butter blend. The delivery window was brutally tight, requiring fulfillment in exactly 14 days. Nolan celebrated the milestone by taking his college fraternity brothers out to a high-end steakhouse downtown, racking up a $400 bar tab to toast his own business acumen. I spent that entire night completely alone in the freezing production facility. The automated filling machine had jammed, a persistent mechanical failure that required me to disassemble the heavy dispensing nozzles with an iron wrench, dig out the crystallized honey by hand, and recalibrate the pressure valves. My knuckles were bleeding, my back ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm, and my clothes smelled permanently of scorched sugar and heavy bleach. At 3 a.m, I finally got the production line running again. I fulfilled that massive order by myself. I saved the account. When Nolan came home late the next afternoon, slightly hungover and glowing with residual pride, he looked at the pallets shrink-wrapped and ready for the freight truck in the loading bay. "See?" he said, grabbing a bottle of cold water from the break room refrigerator. "I told them we could meet the deadline. I just had to push the timeline a little." He did not ask how the work got done. He did not ask if I had slept. The invisible kitchen elves had simply produced his victory. That was the exact moment, the final. Struggling ember of my romantic love for my husband suffocated and died. It was not replaced by fiery, uncontrollable hatred, but by a chilling, forensic detachment. By the time the early spring rolled around, I had not exploded. I had simply gone cold. I had crossed over the invisible, irreversible boundary where betrayal stops aching and starts keeping meticulous records. The hurt burned away entirely, leaving behind a sharp, clean clarity. I stopped waiting for Nolan to remember my value. Instead, I began logging my own hours. I quietly forwarded vital vendor emails to a private, encrypted server. I kept original, time-stamped copies of my recipe testing dates, the copyright registrations, and the signed supplier agreements that bore my legal signature. I was no longer an ignored wife begging for scraps of recognition. I was a silent archivist documenting a grand theft. I realized that Nolan truly believed I was ignorant of my own worth simply because I never shouted about it. He fundamentally confused my silence for stupidity. He thought because I managed the complex background so seamlessly, I belonged in the shadows permanently. He had built his entire public identity and his financial future on the back of my quiet dependability, entirely forgetting one crucial fact. The person who pours the concrete foundation is also the only person who knows exactly where to place the dynamite to bring the whole house down. The morning of March 8th began the same way every morning did, with the sharp scent of citrus and the quiet hum of the commercial refrigerator. I was standing at the expansive marble island in my home kitchen, a space Nolan loved to photograph for lifestyle magazines but rarely cleaned. A fine mist of powdered sugar dusted the dark stone. I was working on the lemon glaze for the new spring gift box collection, testing the viscosity by letting it drip slowly off the back of a silver spoon. It needed to be thick enough to hold its shape during shipping, but delicate enough to crack perfectly when bitten. Next to the mixing bowl lay a stack of proofing sheets for the upcoming packaging run. The printer had misaligned the sage green border by 2 millimeters, a microscopic error that would have made the entire batch look cheap on the shelves. I had caught it at 6 o'clock in the morning. Nolan was still asleep upstairs, wrapped in the heavy linen duvet, recovering from another late-night networking event at exactly 8:45. My phone lit up on the counter, vibrating against the marble. The screen flashed with a new text message from my husband. He had left the house 20 minutes prior, smelling of expensive cedarwood cologne and freshly pressed cotton. I wiped my hands on a kitchen towel and picked up the device. The message contained no greeting. There was no good morning. There was certainly no acknowledgement of the date. Despite the fact that every social media platform, news outlet, and corporate email signature was currently broadcasting that it was International Women's Day, there was only a blunt, unformatted list of instructions. Dinner for 13 tonight. Make the short ribs, skillet cornbread, whipped feta carrots, and the lemon cake. Dress nice. Big night. I stared at the glowing letters. 13 people. It was an enormous physical undertaking to drop on someone with 9 hours' notice. Braised short ribs required a minimum of 4 hours in the oven to achieve the melting tenderness Nolan always bragged about. The skillet cornbread meant adjusting the timing perfectly so it would hit the table screaming hot in the cast iron. The lemon cake, the very one I was currently developing the glaze for, needed to be baked, cooled, and assembled. He was casually ordering a multi-course, restaurant-quality service for a small crowd, as if he were asking me to pick up a carton of milk. A second text arrived a moment later. Guest list: Reed Halpern, Dana from Summit, Victor Lane, my mother, Elise, and Sloan Mercer, plus a few secondary capital guys. My thumb hovered over the glass screen. The inclusion of the other names was expected. Reed Halpern was the golden goose, the lead investor holding the keys to the massive retail expansion. Dana was the buyer who could put our jars on 1,000 shelves. Victor managed the bank accounts. Verna and Elise were the mandatory family audience for Nolan's grand performances. But Sloan Mercer, seeing her name typed out in his casual, dismissive shorthand, landed under my skin like a deep, infected splinter. Sloan was officially hired as an external brand consultant, meant to optimize our narrative for national markets. But over the past 4 months, her presence had bled out of the boardroom and into the strange, quiet corners of our lives. I had seen her name attached to exorbitant consulting invoices that lacked itemized deliverables. I had found calendar entries on our shared family cloud marked simply strategy dinner at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night. I had even found a receipt for a $250 bottle of wine from a downtown hotel bar tucked into the console of his car. When I asked him about it, he had waved his hand, muttering something about client retention and optics. I did not feel the hysterical, tearing jealousy of a woman who suspects an affair. I felt something much sharper and much colder. I felt the profound insult of being treated like a fool. Sloan was polished, unburdened by the grease and flour of actual labor, and completely fluent in the corporate speak that Nolan craved. He wanted to parade her around his beautifully appointed dining room to prove he belonged in her world, and he expected me to stay in the kitchen and cook the food to make the illusion possible. My phone screen dimmed, threatening to go black. I tapped it alive again. The cursor blinked in the reply box. For years. My role in this marriage had been defined by a terrifying, boundless accommodation. I absorbed his stress, I managed his messes, and I smiled when he took the credit. I typed out a single word. Okay. I hit send. It was the exact response Nolan had trained himself to expect. It was the obedient, frictionless answer of a woman who has given up the fight. He had spent years confusing my functional obedience with devoted love, never realizing that compliance is often just the easiest way to avoid an exhausting argument. I set the phone face down on the marble and picked up my spoon to resume testing the glaze. 10 minutes later. The phone rang. It was not Nolan. The caller ID flashed Verna's name. I answered, putting the phone on speaker and setting it back on the counter so I could begin gathering the heavy flour sacks and sugar canisters. Camila, darling, Verna's voice floated out of the small speaker, carrying that distinct, breathless tone she used when she wanted to issue a command disguised as a favor. Good morning, Verna, I replied, keeping my voice perfectly flat. I measured out 3 cups of unbleached flour into a glass bowl. Nolan just called me about the dinner tonight, she said. I wanted to make absolutely sure you understood the stakes. Reed Halpern is bringing his wife. And let me tell you, that woman notices everything. The last time they were hosted at the club, she made a comment about the water spots on the silver. We cannot afford any of your little rustic slip-ups tonight. She paused, likely waiting for me to assure her that I would be diligent. I poured a cup of buttermilk into a measuring jug and said nothing. It needs to feel effortless, Camila, Verna continued, her tone sharpening when I failed to provide the required deference. Polished and expensive, Nolan is right on the edge of securing everything he has ever worked for. Do not make him worry about whether the napkins are ironed properly or if the meat is tough. Just handle the background. I will handle it, I said. Good. Wear the navy silk dress. You look less tired in dark colors, she added, before disconnecting the call without saying goodbye. The kitchen was perfectly quiet again. I stood motionless, my hands resting on the cool edge of the stone counter, staring at the blank, black mirror of my phone. It was March 8th, Women's Day. Out in the real world, corporations were sending out emails celebrating female empowerment. Politicians were making speeches about equality. And here, in my beautiful, expensive cage, my husband had just scheduled me as invisible, unpaid labor for the closing scene of his own self-made myth. He and his mother expected me to break my back for 9 straight hours, creating an atmosphere of effortless luxury, so that he could stand up in a tailored suit and sell the company that I built to a room full of strangers. A strange, settling calm washed over me. The anxiety that usually accompanied these massive hosting demands completely vanished. The frantic need to please him, to protect the brand, to keep the peace, simply evaporated into the citrus-scented air. I looked at the jars of smoked peach glaze lining the pantry shelf. I looked at the worn, leather-bound notebook sitting on my desk, the one containing my grandmother's handwriting and the exact formulas that were about to make Nolan Green a very wealthy man. I decided in that exact moment that I would not argue. I would not call him back and demand respect. I would not refuse to cook. I would do exactly what he asked. I would braise the short ribs until they fell apart at the touch of a fork. I would whip the feta until it was lighter than air. I would bake the lemon cake and glaze it perfectly. I would set the table with the polished silver and the crystal glasses. I would serve him the flawless, beautiful dinner he demanded, but I would not let him control the menu. He thought he was writing the final chapter of his triumphant founder's story tonight. He did not know that I was already holding the pen, and I was going to rewrite the ending right in front of him. The collapse of a marriage rarely begins with a shattered plate or a screaming match in the driveway. It usually begins with a piece of paper. For me, the first undeniable proof that I was living with a predator arrived 3 weeks before the dinner, buried in a stack of Tuesday afternoon mail. It was a standard, automated property notice from our insurance carrier. Most people would have thrown it directly into the recycling bin, assuming it was a routine policy update or a privacy disclosure. But I was the person who spent my days managing food safety compliance down to the microgram. I read the fine print on everything. The letter referenced an administrative change to the hazard coverage on our house in Franklin, mandated by the lender to satisfy the requirements of a recently activated home equity line of credit. My eyes stopped moving. They locked onto the word activated. We did not have a line of credit. When the business started generating real profit 2 years ago, we had aggressively paid down the mortgage. We owned the house outright, a financial milestone Nolan loved to bring up during cocktail hours. I set the envelope down on the kitchen counter. I did not panic. I simply picked up the phone and dialed the toll-free number printed at the bottom of the page. I navigated the automated menu and waited on hold for 7 minutes before a customer service representative named Sarah answered the line. "Thank you for calling Red Clay Bank. How can I help you today?" Sarah asked, her voice bright and mechanically polite. "I received an insurance notice regarding a home equity line on my property, but I believe there has been a clerical error," I said smoothly, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "Could you verify the status of the account for me?" Sarah asked for my security verification. I provided my social security number, our zip code, and my mother's maiden name. I listened to the hollow clatter of her keyboard through the receiver. "It does not appear to be an error, Mrs. Green," Sarah said. "The line of credit for $450,000 was fully approved and accessed last month. The funds were transferred to an external commercial business account under the memo of brand expansion. $450,000. The number rang in my ears, a heavy metallic sound. "I see," I replied. My voice did not shake. "And who authorized this withdrawal?" "Both you and your husband, Nolan Green." Sarah stated cheerfully, "We have the electronic authorization file right here in the system." The digital signature was completed and verified on January 14th at 3 in the afternoon. I thanked her and ended the call. The house was completely silent. I walked over to the calendar hanging inside the pantry door and flipped it back to the previous month, January 14th, a Tuesday. At exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon on that specific Tuesday, I was sitting in a freezing fluorescent-lit waiting room at Memorial Health Hospital in Savannah, Georgia, nearly 500 miles away. My aunt had just undergone emergency gallbladder surgery. I had driven down the day before to help her recover. My phone was buried at the bottom of my purse, powered off to conserve the battery. I had toll booth receipts from the interstate highway. I had a hotel invoice stamped with my physical credit card. I had a digital photograph of myself holding a terrible cup of hospital coffee, time-stamped at exactly 3:14 in the afternoon. I had not signed a bank document. I had not authorized a loan. Nolan had forged my digital signature, silently leveraging the physical roof over my head to fund his ambition while I was sitting in a surgical ward. That night, Nolan came home at 8:30. He kissed my cheek, complained loudly about regional supply chain delays, ate the plate of roasted chicken I had left warming in the oven, and went upstairs to take a shower. I waited until I heard the heavy rush of the water through the ceiling pipes. Then, I walked into his home office and woke up his desktop computer. Nolan had never bothered to secure his administrative drives with a passcode. He genuinely believed that my digital footprint ended at the shared folders labeled Kitchen Logistics and Vendor Invoices. He assumed I had absolutely no interest in the financial architecture of the business, because I was the woman who simply baked and kept the floors clean. I opened the main directory and bypassed the daily operational files. I scrolled down to a subfolder marked Q1 Restructuring. Inside was a dense maze of legal PDFs and drafted contracts. I started reading. The first document I opened was a corporate formation certificate. It was not for hearth and row provisions. The letterhead belonged to a Delaware-registered limited liability company called Ember Ridge Foods. The formation date was less than 2 months old. I scanned the lines looking for the principal officers. There were only 2 names listed: Nolan Green and his sister, Elise. My name, my social security number, My equity stake was nowhere to be found. I clicked into the next file, titled Asset Transfer Schedules. There, neatly typed in 12-point font, was the systematic, legalized theft of my entire life's work. The flagship items, the exact products currently anchoring our massive upcoming retail push, were being formally licensed exclusively to Ember Ridge Foods. He was creating a shadow company, owned entirely by him and his sister, and he was quietly siphoning the vast financial value of my family recipes into it. The smoked peach glaze, the sorghum barbecue base. All the intellectual property I had built with my own hands was being legally walked out at the back door while I was busy managing the kitchen. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to keep clicking. I needed to see the bottom of the well. I found a file labeled Investor Pitch Deck Draft. It was 32 pages of glossy graphics, market projections, and corporate storytelling designed specifically for the capital partners he was currently courting. I scrolled to page 14. The heading read, The Team. There was a full page, professionally retouched portrait of Nolan, wearing a tailored linen shirt, looking rugged, visionary, and incredibly capable. The accompanying text described him as the sole culinary architect of the brand. Beside him was a sleek professional headshot of Elise, listed as the Director of National Strategy. Below Elise, squeezed into a small decorative sidebar at the bottom of the page, was a candid photograph of me arranging fruit on a wooden cutting board. I looked blurry and soft. The caption beneath my photograph did not say co-founder. It did not say head of product development. It did not say operations manager. It read, Camila Green, the heart of the home-inspired aesthetic behind our brand. Aesthetic, a word meaning concerned with beauty, or the appreciation of beauty, a decorative element, a mood board, a feeling, not a person, not an owner, not a creator. I sat back in the leather office chair, staring at the glowing monitor. What truly shocked me in that dark room was not the staggering theft of nearly $500,000 against our home. It was not the secret corporate entity formed with his cruel sister. It was the absolute, sterile professionalism of the erasure. If Nolan had done this in a fit of sudden rage, if we had been screaming at each other over the kitchen island, it would have been a crime of passion. But this was cold. This was methodical. This was a man sitting in an air-conditioned office with expensive corporate lawyers, calmly redesigning reality. He was not pushing me aside in anger. He was legally defining me as a prop, so he could profit from the illusion that I had never been essential in the first place. He was deleting my existence, file by file, dollar by dollar, word by word, and he was doing it with my forged signature. I closed the folders, cleared the recent viewing history on the computer, and turned off the monitor. The screen went black, reflecting my own face back at me in the dark office. I did not shed a single tear. I just started calculating. Once you breach the fortress of a man's secrets, the hidden truth pours out like black water from a cracked dam. I did not stop my investigation with the corporate formation documents. I became a relentless, silent predator in my own home. I spent the next 4 nights waiting until the rhythmic, heavy sound of Nolan's breathing filled the master bedroom. Then, I would slip from the high thread count sheets, walk softly down the oak staircase, and wake up his computer. I began tracing the money first. The accounting software revealed a secondary ledger he assumed I would never find. I discovered a series of wire transfers categorized under vague consulting fees. They were routed directly to a boutique agency owned exclusively by Sloan Mercer. The amounts were staggering and escalating rapidly. $8,000 in November, $12,500 in December, $15,000 by late January. Attached to these financial transfers were expense reports for out-of-state travel, 2 nights at a luxury hotel in Austin, 3 nights at a resort in Nashville. The itemized receipts were murky enough to pass a casual corporate audit, but the room service bills told a different story. There were charges for 2 glasses of expensive champagne at 1 o'clock in the morning and late-night dining for 2. Whether Sloane was physically sharing his hotel bed or merely sharing his ruthless ambition did not matter to me. The reality was that she was cashing massive checks funded by the blisters on my hands. The financial bleed was sickening, but the internal communications were the true autopsy of our marriage. I found an email thread between Nolan and Elise that made the blood freeze in my veins. The subject line read simply, Phase 2. The entire digital discussion revolved around repositioning the founder story for retail scalability. I sat in the dark, the blue light of the monitor illuminating my face, and read the words his sister had typed. We cannot put her on the promotional materials for the Summit shelf launch, Elise wrote, directly referring to me. She is too homemade for national shelves. The buyers want aspiration. They want a sleek, modern lifestyle brand, not a local bake sale. I scrolled down, waiting to see how my husband, the man who had slept beside me for a decade, would defend my honor and my labor. His reply was time-stamped exactly 4 minutes later. Do not worry about it, Nolan wrote. She will settle into a legacy wife role once the deal closes. We just need to keep her comfortable and in the kitchen until the ink is dry. A legacy wife role. A decorative, quiet urn designed to hold the ashes of my own life's work. As I continued digging, the exact purpose of the upcoming dinner party snapped into terrifying focus. It was never just a demanding evening to impress capital investors. I uncovered a drafted agenda for the evening, heavily circulated between Nolan, Elise, and Sloane. Item number 4 on the schedule was titled, Introduction of the New Public Face. Nolan was planning to use my beautifully appointed dining room, my meticulously prepared braised short ribs, and my polished crystal glasses to formally present Sloane Mercer to the investors. He was going to crown her as the refined, sophisticated face of the company's next massive chapter. He fully intended to make me serve the very people who were actively burying me. But arrogance almost always breeds a fatal carelessness. In his frantic rush to build his shadow company and erase my name from the executive letterhead, Nolan had fundamentally misunderstood how the physical supply chain of our business actually functioned. I opened a restricted folder labeled Supplier Agreements. He had drafted fresh, aggressive term sheets for Reed Halpern, claiming exclusive, ironclad control over our entire manufacturing pipeline. He was lying. I pulled up the original contracts with our custom glass jar manufacturer in Ohio, our bulk spice importer, and our primary agricultural co-packer. I stared at the signature lines. Every single one of those legally binding, multi-year master service agreements was signed by me. They were registered exclusively to my individual taxpayer identification number. Not Hearth and Row, and certainly not his secret new entity. I was the one who had spent hours on the phone negotiating the margins. So I was the one who held the legal authority. Nolan was aggressively selling assets to wealthy investors that he absolutely did not control. The deepest, most violent cut, however, did not come from a dry legal document or a cruel email. It came from a careless audio file. It was an attachment on a marketing brief Sloane had forwarded to herself, likely by mistake. I plugged a pair of headphones into the audio jack and clicked play. The recording was slightly muffled, captured on a phone resting on a hard restaurant table. I heard the sharp clinking of heavy cocktail glasses and the low hum of background chatter. I heard Sloane's soft, musical laugh, and then I heard my husband. You have to understand the dynamic. Nolan's voice drifted through the digital static, thick with expensive bourbon and arrogant amusement. Camilla is not built for the boardroom. She still thinks recipes are love, not leverage. She would give it all away for a handwritten thank you card. I sat perfectly still in the dark office, letting that brief audio clip play on a continuous loop until his laughter etched itself into my bones. Love, not leverage. The uncertainty surrounding Sloane remained in my mind. Was she a romantic affair? Someone he touched in those expensive hotel rooms? Or was she simply a highly paid, willing accomplice in a corporate theft? It remained deliberately murky, and to my profound surprise, that ambiguity kept my mind sharp. It prevented me from slipping into the chaotic, messy cliché of a simple infidelity plot. I did not feel the fiery, desperate jealousy of a scorned woman wanting to claw another woman's eyes out. That uncertainty gave me something infinitely more powerful than jealousy. It gave me absolute clarity. I realized in that quiet room that the true betrayal was not another woman. It was not a stolen kiss or a secret affair. It was a husband who had systematically and ruthlessly monetized my devotion. He had taken my grandmother's legacy, my exhausted joints, my burnt fingers, and my unwavering loyalty, and fed them directly into a machine designed to print his own face on a billboard. He had observed my quiet competence and labeled it weakness. He had mistaken my profound silence for a pathetic surrender. He genuinely thought I was a fragile woman playing a sentimental game of love, while he was playing a high-stakes game of leverage. He was about to find out exactly how much leverage a woman holding the matches truly possesses. The natural human instinct upon discovering a betrayal of this magnitude is catastrophic confrontation. You want to scream until your throat bleeds. You want to shatter expensive crystal against the hardwood floors, key his imported car, and watch the terror bloom in his eyes as you lay bare every single one of his lies. But anger is a sloppy weapon. If I had thrown a tantrum in the driveway, Nolan would have immediately spun the narrative. He would have called me unstable, hysterical, and emotionally unfit for the pressures of corporate scaling. He would have used my rage to justify my complete removal from the company. So, I chose the route most dangerous to a careless man. I became impeccably organized. 2 days after I found the audio recording, I walked into the downtown offices of Maddox and Vance, carrying a heavy leather tote bag. The receptionist offered me sparkling water, but I declined, sitting perfectly still on the modern leather sofa until Ava Maddox pushed open the glass doors of the conference room. I knew Ava from a local charity gala we had both sponsored 3 years prior. She was a brutally sharp commercial litigator who had helped me navigate a complicated catering contract for a domestic violence shelter fundraiser. Ava possessed a cold, calculating intelligence that intimidated most men, which was exactly why I needed her. "It is good to see you, Camila," Ava said, gesturing toward the long mahogany table. "What kind of mess are we cleaning up today?" I unzipped my tote bag and began laying out my entire life. I did not cry. I simply presented the architecture of my husband's fraud. I placed my grandmother's original, dated recipe notebooks on the polished wood. I stacked printed copies of vendor emails spanning 5 years, detailed version histories of our product development cycle, and the granular ingredient cost sheets I had meticulously maintained. Next to those, I placed the system administration logs, proving I was the sole creator and maintainer of the company's internal operational software. Finally, I handed her the printouts of the Ember Ridge Foods formation documents and the bank notice regarding the home equity line. Ava put on her reading glasses and spent 45 minutes reviewing the stack in absolute silence. The only sound in the room was the crisp turning of pages and the distant hum of city traffic outside the high windows. When she finally looked up, her expression had shifted from professional curiosity to predatory focus. "He is incredibly arrogant," Ava stated softly, tapping her manicured finger against the bank notice. "And he is phenomenally stupid. You do not just have a grievance, Camilla. You have a loaded gun." Ava outlined the reality of my leverage. I had ironclad authorship evidence and operational proof that predated his new corporate entity by years. I had massive marital asset claims against every single dollar flowing through the business. Furthermore, the supplier relationships were legally bound to my identity. But the absolute centerpiece of our strategy was the forged electronic signature on the home equity authorization. That crossed the line from a domestic marital dispute into federal banking fraud. "If you want to blow up his life, we can file an injunction tomorrow morning," Ava advised, leaning back in her chair, "and we can freeze the accounts and drag him into a brutal, multi-year litigation." "No," I replied smoothly. "A courtroom is a private battle. He wants to replace me publicly. He wants to sell a revised history to his investors. I want to correct that history in the exact room where he intends to tell it. Over the next week, Ava and I worked with the precision of forensic accountants preparing for a major fraud case. We did not draft massive, confusing legal briefs. We prepared a set of simple, brutally digestible packets tailored specifically to the exact individuals Nolan had invited to his grand dinner. For Reed Halpern and the other capital partners, we created investor risk summaries. These single-page documents clearly outline the contested ownership timelines and the severe legal liabilities attached to the flagship product lines they were about to purchase. For Dana Bishop, the retail buyer, we prepared documentation proving the gap between Nolan's polished founder story and the underlying operational records, highlighting the instability of the supplier contracts. For Victor Lane at the bank, we included a notice of expense anomalies and a formal inquiry regarding the verification protocols used on the January 14th property loan. And for Nolan, I prepared a separate, private envelope. It was much thicker than the rest. It contained a finalized petition for divorce, citing financial misconduct. It held a formal cease and desist notice strictly disputing his right to use my recipes, my likeness, or my family history in any commercial capacity without a newly negotiated, heavily compensated agreement. Finally, it included a draconian financial preservation demand, legally freezing his ability to move a single dollar out of any shared or hidden accounts. Which brings us back to the late afternoon of March 8th, Women's Day. I stood in my kitchen, the afternoon sun casting long, golden shadows across the marble island. I did not destroy the food. I did not oversalt the meat or burn the sugar. Sabotage is the tool of the powerless. Instead, I cooked with more focus and care than I had ever exercised in my entire life. The short ribs were resting in a heavy Dutch oven, swimming in a rich, dark reduction of red wine and beef stock. The whipped feta was perfectly aerated, waiting to be piped onto the roasted carrots. I was gently folding fresh rosemary into the cast iron skillet for the cornbread. The elegance of the evening was my armor. If the dinner was chaotic, if the food was mediocre, Nolan could easily dismiss my documents as the desperate thrashing of a bitter, unhinged wife who could not handle the pressure of his success. But if the service was flawless, if the house was a picture of refined Southern grace, the truth inside those envelopes would become impossible to ignore. The perfection of the meal would prove my ultimate competence. At 5 o'clock in the evening, I carried the stack of cream-colored envelopes into the dining room. The space was a masterpiece of domestic staging. The long walnut table was polished to a mirror shine. The heavy silver cutlery was perfectly aligned. The crystal wine goblets caught the light of the setting sun. I walked around the table, acting as the stage manager for a catastrophic audit my husband never saw coming. I placed the investor summaries beneath the folded menu cards at Reed's and Victor's seats. I set the supply chain warnings down for Dana. I tucked the exposure documents at Sloane's setting. Finally, I placed the thickest envelope directly beneath the dessert plate, resting on Nolan's place setting at the head of the table. By 6:30 in the evening, the house smelled absolutely divine. The heavy, intoxicating aroma of browned butter, fresh rosemary, and charred citrus hung in the warm air, mingling with the delicate scent of finishing sugar drifting from the cooling lemon cakes. It was the exact sensory experience Nolan had demanded to sell his illusion. I stood alone in the dining room one last time, smoothing a microscopic wrinkle from the edge of the linen tablecloth. Hidden beneath the beautiful china and the elegant menus sat the entire foundation of everything my husband had built his unearned success upon. And hidden right beside it sat the very instruments that were about to tear it all away. I checked my reflection in the glass of the china cabinet, adjusted the collar of my navy silk dress, and went to the front door to welcome my guests. The doorbell rang at exactly 6:30 in the evening. The arrival of guests for a high-stakes business dinner never happens in a sudden rush. It is a carefully choreographed wave. It is an exhibition of expensive wool coats, practiced smiles, and people already half performing the version of the night they want to remember. I stood in the foyer, the heavy silk of my dark dress brushing against my calves, and opened the mahogany front door to let the outside world into my meticulously staged trap. Reed Halpern arrived first, stepping out of a black town car. He possessed that specific kind of warmth that wealthy men use to disarm the people they intend to evaluate. His eyes were constantly moving, taking a sharp, calculating inventory of the space before he even handed me his coat. "Camilla, the house looks absolutely magnificent," Reed said, offering a bottle of vintage wine. "Nolan has been promising us a taste of the real Hearth and Row experience for weeks. We are so glad you could make it." "Reed," I replied, my tone perfectly calibrated to sound gracious and deferential. Dana Bishop from Summit Shelf Markets arrived right behind him. Dana did not look at the art on the walls or the antique rug in the hallway. Her gaze instinctively evaluated the lighting and the table setting as if she were inspecting an end cap display she might want to optimize for consumer engagement. Victor Lane from Red Clay Bank followed her, stiff and formal in a dark gray suit, alongside two other prospective capital partners whose names Nolan had forwarded, but whose faces blurred into a uniform expression of expectant greed. I took their coats, murmuring polite welcomes, smoothly playing the role of the devoted hostess. Then came the family. Verna swept through the doorway as though she personally held the deed to the property in her quilted designer handbag. She did not wait for me to take her coat. She draped it over the banister and immediately marched into the dining room. Under the thin excuse of being maternally helpful, she began inspecting my labor. I watched from the hallway as she ran a manicured index finger along the base of a crystal water glass, checking for hard water spots, and then slightly repositioned a floral arrangement of white hydrangeas I had spent 20 minutes balancing. "It is a bit heavy on the greenery, Camilla," Verna called out, not bothering to look in my direction. "But we can make it work. Just ensure the overhead lighting stays low enough. Reed gets headaches from harsh bulbs." Elise appeared 10 minutes later, dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal blazer that screamed of corporate ambition. She did not bring wine, nor did she offer a compliment. She carried a leather portfolio, holding it tightly against her chest like a shield. She walked right past me with a brisk, transactional nod, carrying herself like a newly minted executive. She was already treating the company as though I had been completely phased out of the operation. "Are the appetizers circulating yet?" Elise demanded, her tone flat and entirely stripped of familial warmth. Reed cannot stand around with an empty glass. It makes him anxious, and anxious men do not sign large checks. "The trays are coming out now," I assured her, my voice betraying nothing. The final arrival of the early wave was Sloane Mercer. She stepped into the foyer smelling of sandalwood and expensive dry cleaning. She wore a slip dress in a muted emerald green, perfectly draped, telegraphing an effortless luxury that I knew cost hours to achieve. Sloane possessed a dangerous kind of comfort in my home. She knew exactly where the guest powder room was located without asking for directions. She moved toward the living room with a fluid grace, slipping right into the center of the conversation with the capital partners. She brought an undeniable, pulsing chemistry into the space, a silent claim on the evening that everyone in the room noticed but no one possessed the vulgarity to name out loud. By 7:15, the living room was buzzing with the low, steady hum of networking, but the host was notably absent. Nolan made his entrance deliberately late. It was a classic, transparent power maneuver. He wanted to force the room to wait for him. He wanted to wear the posture of a tremendously important man who had just managed to tear himself away from building a regional empire to join his perfect home and his perfect, quiet wife. The front door swung open, and he strode in, bringing a rush of cool spring air and the scent of leather with him. He dropped his briefcase by the console table, rolled his shoulders back, and ran a hand through his carefully styled hair. He walked straight over to where I was standing near the arched entryway to the kitchen. He leaned down and pressed a quick, dry kiss to my cheek. It was a transaction, an action performed entirely for the benefit of Dana Bishop, who was watching us from the sofa. "Is everything under control?" Nolan asked, his voice low enough that only I could hear. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not ask if I was exhausted after 9 straight hours of manual labor over a hot stove. He only cared about the machinery of the evening functioning smoothly. The absolute ordinariness of his disregard landed harder than a physical blow, precisely because it was so thoroughly routine. He truly viewed me as an appliance that needed to be checked for operational readiness. "Everything is perfectly stationed," I replied, my voice as smooth and cold as glass. I signaled for the hired bartender to begin passing the signature drinks, a bourbon smash infused with our own charred rosemary syrup. As the heavy crystal tumblers found their way into the hands of the investors, Nolan began to perform. He moved through the living room like a seasoned politician, touching elbows, laughing at all the right intervals, and slowly priming the room for his grand announcement. He steered the conversations effortlessly from golf courses and stock portfolios toward the massive potential of the Southern artisan market. I brought out a silver tray of small, savory tarts filled with caramelized onions and the whipped honey butter I had spent months adapting from my grandmother's notes. Reed took a bite, his eyes widening in genuine appreciation. "Nolan, this flavor profile is incredible," Reed said, holding up the half-eaten tart. "It is complex but incredibly accessible for a mass market." Nolan smiled, a broad, deeply satisfied expression that stretched across his handsome face. He caught Sloane's eye from across the room before answering. "Thank you, Reed. We spent a long time dialing in that exact balance." Nolan said effortlessly, "It is all about honoring the raw ingredients. You have to understand the heritage to get the taste right. That is what we are selling. Authenticity." He said we. He said you have to understand. He absorbed the compliment entirely, metabolizing my literal sweat, my family history, and my burned fingertips into his own personal genius. He stood 3 feet away from me, wearing a custom suit paid for by my recipes, and accepted the praise as if I were nothing more than the silver tray holding the food. The chilling clarity of the moment washed over me. Every single compliment spoken in that room about the warmth of the home, the elegance of the plating, or the complex taste of the food was instantly redirected by Nolan to feed his own massive ego. He was a black hole of credit, pulling all the light in the room toward himself. I smiled politely at Reed, offered the tray to Victor, and turned to walk back to the kitchen. The social performance was reaching its peak. But I felt no anger. I only felt the quiet, steady rhythm of a metronome counting down to the final course. Dinner commenced with the kind of orchestrated perfection that money attempts to buy, but only exhaustive labor can actually produce. I moved seamlessly around the long walnut table, serving the braised bourbon peach short ribs. The meat yielded instantly under the weight of the heavy silver forks, pooling in a rich dark reduction of wine and marrow. Next came the whipped feta carrots, drizzled with black pepper honey. The bitter greens tossed with shaved fennel to provide a sharp, acidic contrast to the heavy meat, and the skillet cornbread that steamed gently, smelling intensely of browned butter and toasted cornmeal as I cut it into thick wedges. The lemon cake, my ultimate weapon, waited silently in the cool shadows of the kitchen for a few seductive, intoxicating minutes. The scene played out exactly as my husband had envisioned it in his wildest, most arrogant dreams. The wine loosened the stiff postures of the bankers. Laughter flowed easily, bouncing off the high ceiling and the expensive art hanging on the dining room walls. Admiration collected around Nolan like iron shavings drawn to a powerful magnet. He was holding court, expansive and relaxed, completely in his element. He poured more Cabernet, told a charming anecdote about a minor supply chain disaster he claimed to have single-handedly averted, and basked in the glow of his impending wealth. Dana Bishop leaned forward, resting her elbows lightly on the table, her eyes bright with genuine professional interest. "I have to ask, Nolan," Dana said, gesturing with her fork toward the short ribs. "The flavor profile on this glaze is spectacular. It has a depth you do not usually find in commercial scalability. Where did the initial concept come from?" The question hung in the air for a fraction of a second. I paused near the mahogany sideboard, a crystal water pitcher heavy in my hand, waiting to see if the man would finally share the light. He did not. Nolan answered entirely too fast, his voice slick with practiced humility. "It is just a little family inspiration. Dana," he replied smoothly, waving a hand as if dismissing a trivial detail. "A nod to our Southern heritage. But the real magic is how we have standardized the extraction process for the retail line. By utilizing the new co-packing facility in Ohio, we can guarantee a 22% reduction in unit cost while maintaining that exact artisanal taste." He pivoted so flawlessly from my grandmother's legacy to his profit margins that the investors nodded along, completely captivated by the business metrics. They ate my history while praising his future. He had successfully reduced my bloodline to a generic marketing bullet point. Midway through the meal, after the plates had been mostly cleared and the second round of expensive wine had been poured, Nolan tapped his silver knife lightly against his crystal goblet. The clear, ringing chime cut through the low hum of conversation. The table fell silent. All eyes turned toward the head of the table. Nolan stood up, buttoning his tailored suit jacket with a theatrical solemnity. He looked around the room, making deliberate eye contact with Reed Halpern, then Victor Lane, then his mother, and finally, he let his gaze rest briefly on me. "We are gathered here tonight on the brink of something truly monumental," Nolan began, his voice rich with feigned emotion. "But today is also International Women's Day, and as I look around this room, I am reminded that no enterprise is ever built in a vacuum. We owe our success to the foundations laid by others. So, I want to raise a glass to the women who make men bold enough to build." It was a masterclass in manipulation. On the surface, it sounded incredibly flattering, a generous tribute from a modern, enlightened executive. But as the words landed, the heavy, suffocating condescension became impossible to ignore. He was not thanking us for building alongside him. He was thanking us for creating the comfortable, frictionless vacuum in which he could thrive. He was praising the silent scaffolding that holds up the monument, fully intending to tear that scaffolding down the moment the monument is unveiled to the public. Which brings me to the next chapter of Hearth and Row provisions. Nolan continued, his tone shifting from sentimental to sharply professional. He reached behind him and picked up a sleek, leather-bound portfolio, identical to the one Elise had carried in earlier. "As we finalize this massive retail expansion, our corporate structure must evolve to meet the relentless demands of a national market." He began a highly polished, incredibly rehearsed mini presentation right there in the dining room. He announced, with sweeping grandeur, that Elise would be stepping into the role of Executive Vice President of Brand Growth, overseeing all major distributor relationships and corporate strategy. The investors nodded approvingly. Elise sat up straighter, a smug, tight smile playing on her lips. She did not even glance in my direction. Then, Nolan turned his attention to Sloan Mercer. "Furthermore, as we transition from a local favorite to a household name, we need a refined, aspirational lifestyle campaign to drive our consumer engagement. I am thrilled to announce that Sloan Mercer will be joining our executive team permanently to spearhead this new public initiative." Sloan lowered her eyes modestly, accepting the polite applause that rippled around the table. A perfectly choreographed display of false humility. She looked every inch the polished, expensive future my husband wanted to buy. "And finally," Nolan said, his voice dropping into a register of thick, paternalistic affection. He gestured toward me, standing quietly by the doorway. "My beautiful wife, Camilla. She has been the domestic heart of this journey since the very beginning. With this new executive team in place, and the heavy lifting finally transferred to the corporate level, Camilla will finally get to step back, relax, and simply enjoy the results of all our hard work." The room applauded again, a polite, sustained clapping that felt less like celebration and more like a formal burial. I felt the internal temperature of my body drop to absolute zero. The blood in my veins slowed to a glacial crawl. He had done it. He had actually stood in my dining room, full of the food I had cooked, surrounded by the walls I had paid for, and publicly redefined my entire existence without a single ounce of my consent. He had legally and socially stripped me of my company, repackaged my exhaustive labor as a quaint domestic hobby, handed my future over to his sister and his consultant, and expected me to smile gratefully for the forced retirement. I did not scream. I did not throw the heavy crystal pitcher at his head. The icy detachment that had been building inside me for weeks solidified into an unbreakable, brilliant diamond. I waited. I let the applause fade completely into the walls. I let the self-congratulatory smiles settle onto the faces of my husband, my sister-in-law, and the brand consultant who genuinely thought she had just won the lottery. When the room was perfectly quiet, the only sound being the soft crackle of the fireplace, I stepped forward from the shadows of the arched entryway. The heavy silk of my dress rustled softly against the hardwood floor. "Thank you, Nolan," I said. My voice was gentle, measured, and completely devoid of the sharp edge of bitterness they might have expected. It was the calm, soothing tone of a woman fully in control of her domain. It has been an incredible journey, and before we move on to the dessert service, I wanted to ensure that everyone here tonight truly grasps the foundation of this company. Nolan beamed at me from the head of the table. His chest puffed out slightly against his white shirt. He genuinely assumed I was leaning into the branding moment, playing the role of the supportive legacy wife, adding a touch of rustic, emotional charm to his corporate victory lap. He thought I was about to talk about love, about family traditions, about the magic of a warm kitchen and a supportive marriage. "I have prepared one final course," I continued, making deliberate, unblinking eye contact with Reed Halpern. "It is something I put together myself, to help all of you understand the product story and the ownership structure much more completely. It is waiting for you now." Nolan's smile was broad, confident, and utterly blind to the woman who was about to dismantle everything he had built. He gestured expansively toward the table, inviting his guests to indulge in whatever sentimental treat he thought I had provided. He did not notice the subtle, dangerous shift in the room's energy until Reed Halpern reached forward, slid his fingers beneath the folded menu card at his place setting, and pulled out the thick, cream-colored envelope. I stood perfectly still, watching the golden light of the candles flicker across my husband's face, waiting for the exact second he realized the evening no longer belonged to him. Reed Halpern broke the heavy wax seal with his thumb. The crisp, sharp tear of the thick paper was the only sound in the dining room. He unfolded the document, adjusted his posture, and began to read. I stood quietly by the arched doorway, watching the exact moment the warm, benevolent smile of a wealthy patron vanished from his face, replaced entirely by the cold, lethal focus of a man protecting his capital. "Nolan," Reed said. His voice was stripped of all prior warmth, dropping into a flat, authoritative register. "I am looking at a legal summary regarding the intellectual property for the smoked peach glaze and the sorghum barbecue base. It appears the core product line anchoring your initial funding pitch relies on trademarks and supplier agreements that are exclusively registered to Camila, not your new entity. Why does Ember Ridge Foods not have clean ownership of these assets?" Nolan froze. The color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray, before a hot mottled red began to creep up his neck. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against his crisp white collar. "Reed, that is just administrative red tape," Nolan stammered, his practiced charm faltering instantly. "Camilla is simply confused about the transition process. We are restructuring the holding companies this quarter." Before Nolan could finish his desperate sentence, Dana Bishop had already torn open her own envelope. She bypassed the legal summaries and went straight to the origin timeline Ava and I had prepared. "Confused?" Dana asked, her eyes darting from the heavy paper to Nolan. Her tone was no longer that of an impressed buyer. It was the sharp inquiry of a woman who realized she was being sold a counterfeit bill of goods. I have a photocopies of dated kitchen test logs here. I have version histories of the packaging edits and the original product naming drafts, all in Camilla's handwriting, dating back 5 years before Ember Ridge Foods even existed. Your pitch deck claimed you conceptualized the entire line during a solo retreat in the mountains last year. This timeline proves the supposed company vision began entirely in her hands, not yours. The unraveling accelerated. Victor Lane, the man representing Red Clay Bank, pulled his document free from the cream envelope. As he read the notice of expense anomalies, his posture went entirely rigid. He stopped breathing for 2 full seconds. He looked up, bypassing Nolan entirely, and stared directly at me. "Mrs. Green," Victor said, his voice tight with rising panic. "This note regarding the home equity authorization. It states you were in Savannah, Georgia, on January 14th. The exact day the digital signature was executed for a $450,000 draw against your property." "That is correct, Victor," I replied evenly, my voice projecting clearly across the silent room. "I have included the time-stamped toll booth receipts, the hotel invoices, and my hospital visitation logs in your packet. I did not sign that authorization." Victor swallowed audibly. A contested timeline was a business dispute. A forged signature on a federal banking document tied to commercial financing representations was a massive, immediate felony. He pushed his chair back slightly from the table, as if physically distancing himself from the liability radiating from my husband. "Panic is a highly contagious disease among the guilty." Elise, sensing the catastrophic collapse of the entire corporate structure, panicked first. She dropped her leather portfolio onto the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. She realized instantly that the prestigious vice president title she had been flaunting all evening was built on a fraudulent foundation. She turned on her brother with the vicious survival instinct of a cornered animal. "Nolan," Elise hissed, her voice cracking with fear and rage, entirely exposing the depth of the deception. "You explicitly told me she had already agreed to step aside. You told the board the buyout paperwork was already finalized and that she wanted to quietly retire. You said she signed off on the Ember Ridge transfer." "Elise, shut up," Nolan snapped, his mask completely gone now, revealing the frantic, cruel man underneath, across the table. Sloane Mercer opened her copy. The polished, untouchable veneer she had worn all evening shattered into 1,000 pieces. She stared at the internal transfer records detailing the exorbitant consulting fees she had been paid. Below the financial ledgers were printed excerpts of internal emails. She read the harsh, demeaning messages where Nolan referred to me as a legacy wife who needed to be kept in the dark while they repositioned the brand. Sloane's hands began to shake. Whether she had known about the stolen recipes or the forged signatures was irrelevant in that moment. She saw the ugly, exploitative machinery she had been folded into. She saw the deliberate omission of my existence in every strategy meeting she had billed for. She could not deny that she had benefited immensely from a lie, and the irrefutable proof of her complicity was sitting right on her lap, visible to every major investor in the region. Nolan realized he was losing the room rapidly. He resorted to the only tactic careless men have left when their lies are exposed. He tried to make me the villain. He stood up abruptly, his heavy oak chair scraping violently against the floor. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "This is completely out of line," Nolan shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He looked desperately at Reed, then at Dana. "Do not listen to this. Camila is overreacting. She is highly emotional right now. She does not understand the complexities of corporate restructuring and equity dilution. She has been working too many hours in the kitchen and she is embarrassing herself. This is a private family matter that she is blowing out of proportion." His defense collapsed the second the words left his mouth. Calling a woman emotional only works when she is actually acting emotional. But I was not screaming. I was not crying. I was not throwing plates or begging for my dignity. I simply stood by the doorway with my hands folded neatly in front of me, radiating an absolute, terrifying calm. The documents I had provided were clean, simple, and forensically precise. They were impossible to explain away with a charming smile or a gaslighting accusation. "I understand perfectly. Nolan," I said, my voice cutting through his frantic shouting like a surgical blade. I did not raise my pitch a single decibel. I answered his panic with pure, cold data. "I understand that on November 12th, you wired $15,000 from our joint operating account to a private LLC without my consent. I understand that our primary co-packing agreement with the facility in Ohio is legally bound exclusively to my taxpayer identification number. That means your projected 22% margin increase is entirely dependent on a manufacturing pipeline you do not actually control." Nolan opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He was suffocating on the truth. "Furthermore," I continued, taking one step into the dining room, "I understand that Ember Ridge Foods cannot legally produce, market, or distribute a single jar of our top 3 selling items without immediately infringing on my registered copyrights. You do not own the recipes. You do not own the supplier contracts. And as of this evening, you do not own the narrative." The more precise I was, the smaller Nolan became. He physically shrank under the weight of the undeniable facts. His broad shoulders slumped. His arrogant posture evaporated. He could not smile his way out of federal bank fraud. He could not charm his way past 5 years of documented operational records. I looked around the beautiful room I had curated. The braised short ribs sitting on the fine bone china plates were rapidly cooling, the rich fat congealing around the edges. The expensive Cabernet sat untouched in the crystal goblets. The silver forks remained resting on the linen napkins. The 13 guests were no longer attending a celebratory dinner. The elegant, candlelit dining room that Nolan thought he completely controlled had been transformed into a brutal, unforgiving boardroom. The investors were not drinking his wine. They were frantically flipping through pages, cross-referencing dates, and performing emergency due diligence right at my dinner table. Nolan stood at the head of the table, entirely isolated, looking at the ruins of his stolen empire. He had wanted to host a masterclass in corporate storytelling. Instead, he had provided the venue for his own professional execution, and I had simply provided the paperwork. I walked back into the kitchen, leaving the absolute, suffocating silence of the dining room behind me. The glazed lemon cake sat on the cool marble counter, catching the ambient light. It was a beautiful creation, smelling brightly of citrus and deep, toasted vanilla. I picked up the heavy silver cake knife. For 9 solid hours, I had been treated as invisible, unpaid labor in my own home, a mere appliance expected to facilitate my husband's grand ascension. But now, I was the one controlling the final course. I cut the cake with surgical, terrifying calm. Each slice was mathematically identical. I transferred the pieces onto the fine porcelain dessert plates with a silver server. I loaded the heavy tray and carried it back into the war zone. The air in the dining room was brittle enough to snap. I walked directly to the head of the long walnut table. Nolan was staring blindly at the thickest envelope resting precisely beneath his empty dessert plate. His hands were trembling so violently that the heavy, cream-colored paper shook audibly as he broke the wax seal. He pulled out the thick stack of documents. The first page he saw was a formal petition for divorce, citing severe financial misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty. The second document was a comprehensive legal dispute over the ownership and commercial usage of my family recipes and my personal story. The third was a stark, uncompromising notice from my attorney, explicitly stating that any continued use of my intellectual property without a newly negotiated, heavily compensated agreement would trigger immediate devastating litigation. "What is this?" Nolan whispered. His voice was completely hollow, stripped of all the booming resonance he had weaponized just moments before he could attempt to spin a lie. Reed Halpern placed his hands flat on the polished table. He did not look at Nolan with anger. He looked at him with the cold, absolute disgust of a man who realized he had almost bought a stolen car. "Nolan," Reed said, his voice echoing with finality, Pinecrest Family Capital is officially suspending our investment discussions. We operate on transparency until an independent legal review can establish clean ownership, truthful financial disclosures, and proper legal authority over this entire product line. We are withdrawing our term sheet immediately. You have completely misrepresented the foundation of this company. Dana Bishop pushed her chair back, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the floor. Summit Shelf Markets will not touch a retail launch built on contested provenance, Dana stated. Her tone was strictly business, devoid of any social courtesy. We do not sell products backed by a false founder narrative, and we certainly do not expose our regional supply chain to shaky vendor control. Consider our prospective purchase orders completely voided as of this exact minute. Victor Lane stood up, buttoning his dark suit jacket with stiff, precise movements. Red Clay Bank will be placing a hard freeze on any pending expansion funds tied to your current financial disclosures, Victor informed him quietly. Given the severe discrepancies regarding the home equity representation and the timeline of the digital signature, our fraud department will be initiating a full mandatory review by tomorrow morning. I strongly suggest you retain separate legal counsel. The massive financial scaffolding beneath my husband collapsed completely before a single bite of dessert was eaten. Sloane Mercer stood up from her chair. She did not say a word to Nolan. She did not attempt to defend her brand strategy or soothe his shattered ego. She finally saw with perfect clarity that she was either a decorative, disposable prop in his fantasy, or a legally liable co-signer on massive corporate fraud. She picked up her emerald green clutch, turned on her heel, and walked straight out of the dining room. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of her expensive heels against the hardwood floor sounded like a metronome marking the end of Nolan's career. The heavy front door opened and closed, leaving behind only the faint scent of sandalwood and absolute humiliation. Verna and Elise remained frozen in their seats. They were forced to sit there, surrounded by the cooling food and the scattered legal documents, and swallow a kind of total, public defeat that no amount of aristocratic family confidence could ever smooth over. Elise stared blankly at the wall, realizing her prestigious new executive title was entirely fictional. Verna looked at her son, her golden boy, and saw nothing but a massive liability. I looked down at the man who had tried to systematically erase my existence. I decided to deliver the final, crushing blow. You assumed you could simply take it, I told him, my voice steady and completely devoid of pity. You thought you could build a shadow company, forge my signature, and lock me out of my own life. But you never actually secured the future you were boasting about all night. The original supplier relationships remain under my soul. Legal authority. The source notes for the next 3 phases of product development. The exact formulas your investors wanted are locked in a bank vault you cannot access. You own an empty shell. Nolan, I own the engine. The guests evacuated the dining room with the frantic, polite speed of wealthy people fleeing a burning building. They gathered their expensive coats in silence and left without looking back. Within 10 minutes, the front door clicked shut for the final time. We were entirely alone. The house was dead quiet, save for the low crackle of the fireplace. Nolan stood up from the ruined table. His face was twisted into a desperate, ugly mask of rage and panic. He tried one last time to shrink his massive, calculated corporate fraud into a petty, emotional domestic dispute. You are completely insane, Nolan yelled, his voice cracking violently. You threw away millions of dollars. You destroyed our marriage and our future over a bruised ego because you wanted to play the victim. I looked at the melted wax of the candles, the abandoned crystal wine glasses, and the legal documents scattered across the expensive linen tablecloth. You asked me to cook for 13 on Women's Day, I answered, my voice dropping to a calm, absolute zero. So I served every one of them the truth, in the long, difficult aftermath. I did not receive a neat, cartoonish ending where the villain is hauled away in handcuffs while I walk blissfully into the sunset. The real world demands a much more grounded resolution. But I got something deeply realistic and infinitely more satisfying. through the relentless work of Ava Maddox. I maintained absolute legal leverage. I secured robust financial protection, permanently untangling my personal assets from his collapsing, debt-ridden entities. I forced him to formally surrender any and all claims to my intellectual property in exchange for my agreement not to pursue federal forgery charges with the banking authorities. Most importantly, I got my dignity back. I did not have to leave my home. I kept the house. Today, I am standing on the concrete floor of a new commercial kitchen. I am currently overseeing the production of a new artisan pantry line, built entirely under my own name, operating strictly on my own terms. I negotiate the contracts, I own the patents, and I sign the checks. The work is exhausting, but the air is finally clean. There is absolutely no one left to call me invisible. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below, so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me even more by pressing the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.